of waiting, our ancestors were not standing still. They were quietly sharpening the very traits that would one day allow them to step beyond their homeland and reshape the planet. The key lies in the brain. Fossils show that 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens looked much like us in the face but carried smaller, less developed skulls. Over time, the brain expanded not just in size but in complexity, giving rise to planning, imagination, symbolic thought, and eventually, language. This was not an overnight leap. It was a slow, grinding process of trial and error, of survival under shifting climates, of tribes adapting or disappearing. Stone tools became sharper, blades more refined, fire more controlled. And with these changes came something more elusive: culture. Archaeological sites in South Africa reveal pigment use and early carvings over 70,000 years ago, small signs that our ancestors were beginning to think in symbols, to create meaning beyond mere survival. These sparks of creativity may have been the decisive advantage, the hidden weapon that separated us from Neanderthals and Denisovans. But here's the suspenseful twist. These changes did not happen everywhere at once. Some regions of Africa advanced faster, others slower, and the constant mixing of groups ensured that innovations spread unevenly. It was like a slow fuse burning across the continent until finally, it reached the critical point where Homo sapiens became not just another human, but the human. And yet, even with these abilities, our ancestors remained bound to Africa for tens of thousands of years more. Why? Because skill alone was not enough. Conditions had to align, climates had to shift, and opportunities had to open. Only when those pieces fell into place did the great exodus begin. Stay tuned, because in the next chapter, the world outside Africa awaits, and it was anything but welcoming. When the Great Migration finally began around 60,000 years ago, it was not a single heroic march, but waves of small groups pushing outward, step by step, coast by coast, often vanishing as quickly as they appeared. The first footsteps beyond Africa likely followed shorelines, hugging the coasts of the Red Sea and Arabian Peninsula, using fish and shellfish as a lifeline. These were not armies but fragile families, carrying stone tools, fire, and memory, but little else. The journey was perilous. Deserts stretched endless, glaciers loomed to the north, predators stalked from the shadows, and hostile climates waited at every turn. And yet, something had changed this time. Our ancestors did not retreat. Armed with sharper blades, social bonds, and perhaps the beginnings of complex language, they adapted with extraordinary resilience. Within a few thousand years, humans had spread into Asia, and from there into Europe, where they finally encountered their powerful cousins, the Neanderthals. The meeting was not a clash of titans, but something more complicated: cooperation, rivalry, and even interbreeding. DNA evidence today reveals that these encounters left permanent marks in our blood, shaping immunity, hair, and skin. But survival outside Africa was never guaranteed. Countless groups must have perished, leaving no trace, their stories lost forever. The suspense lies in what we still don't know. How many times did we leave before this great exodus? How many vanished migrations are hidden beneath the sands of Arabia or the jungles of India? What we do know is that by clinging to Africa for so long, our species had unknowingly prepared for dominance. Every failed journey, every generation of waiting, forged the resilience to endure the hostile worlds beyond. Still, one final twist remains. Even as Homo sapiens spread across the globe, other human species continued to walk beside us for tens of thousands of years before vanishing into extinction. But why did they disappear while we survived? The answer lies not just in strength or intelligence, but in something far more profound. Stay tuned, because in the final chapter, we will confront the mystery of why we alone remain. For tens of thousands of years after leaving Africa, Homo sapiens were not the only humans alive. Europe still belonged to the Neanderthals, Asia to the Denisovans, Indonesia to the tiny Homo floresiensis, and parts of Africa may have sheltered remnants of archaic humans we barely understand. The Earth was once a crowded stage of rival species, each adapted to its own environment, each carrying its own story of survival. So why, in the end, are we the only ones left? Some blame violence, that our ancestors outcompeted or even exterminated their cousins. Others point to climate shifts that devastated fragile populations. But the deeper truth may be stranger. Cooperation, adaptability, and imagination gave us the edge. Where Neanderthals mastered hunting large game, we learned to hunt in groups, to share food across wider social networks, to survive lean times by relying on one another. Where other humans shaped tools, we reshaped ideas, passing knowledge between tribes, innovating faster than others could follow. And where others saw a world of obstacles, we saw pathways. The very fact that we carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA proves we mingled, absorbed, and then outlasted them, becoming the final human standing. Yet the suspenseful question remains, was it inevitable? Could the world have been different? A place where multiple humans thrive side by side? We will never know, because by 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone, Denisovans vanished, and the hobbits of Flores were only a fading memory. The tangled branches of the human family tree had been pruned by time until one branch ours remained. But that survival was not destiny. It was the fragile outcome of chance, adaptation, and the long patience of Africa. So why did early humans take so long to leave Africa? The answer is both simple and profound. Africa was not a prison, but a paradise, vast enough to hold the seeds of humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, rich enough to sustain us when the rest of the world froze, and diverse enough to forge the resilience we would one day need. Staying behind was not hesitation, it was preparation. Every failed migration, every drought survived, every tool sharpened in the fires of Africa was a rehearsal for the moment we finally broke free. And when that moment came, we carried with us not just flesh and bone, but stories written in DNA, memories of ancient cousins, and the spark of imagination that set us apart. The suspense remains, of course, because our past is far from fully uncovered. Fossils still lie buried, timelines still shift, and the definition of human itself is still debated. Were the skulls in Morocco truly us? Were there other migrations we will never discover? These are mysteries for the future. But one truth stands unshaken. Africa was the crucible, the garden, the web of origins, the continent that shaped us into who we are. Without those long ages of waiting, we would not have been ready to face the world. And so, in the end, the story of why we stayed is the story of why we survived. Something extraordinary was happening inside Africa during those long millennia. For countless millennia, Africa was not a place humans wanted to escape. It was the very heart of life itself. Picture this, a continent so vast that the United States, India, and China could rest inside it with room to spare. 12 million square miles of rivers, savannas, deserts, and coastal teeming with food, water, and shelter. A world where no glacier ever choked the land, where the climate shifted but never froze into an uninhabitable wasteland. So why, then, did it take our ancestors so unbearably long to step beyond Africa's borders? Why did the species that would one day dominate the earth stay rooted in this one colossal garden for over 100,000 years? The answer, as you will see, is far more tangled and dramatic than any simple story of migration. It's not just about survival, it's about rivalry with other humans, secrets locked in stone tools, and skulls buried for 300,000 years. But here's the twist. Even the very definition of what we call human is still up for debate. Were those early figures in Morocco truly our kind, or something else entirely? And what if the Garden of Eden wasn't a single place at all, but the entire continent itself? Stay tuned, because this story will rewrite everything you thought you knew about where we came from and why we stayed behind for so long. The tale begins deep in prehistory, when modern humans, Homo sapiens, were not yet the rulers of the planet, but merely one of many human species walking the earth. Africa, colossal and endlessly diverse, was their cradle but also their cage. Though not in the way you might think. Anthropologists long believed the story of humanity began in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, with a neat linear spread outward toward Europe and Asia, but this picture has crumbled under the weight of new discoveries. Fossils from Morocco, dated to 300,000 years ago, suddenly stretch our timeline backward, revealing faces that look strikingly familiar and yet not entirely modern faces with broad cheekbones and rounded skulls, but brains smaller than ours, a sign that we had not yet completed the journey of becoming fully human. Were these our ancestors or a cousin line that vanished into extinction? That question remains unsettled, and I'll tell you later why that matters so much. For now, hold on to the image of a continent alive with tribes of proto-humans scattered across deserts and grasslands, all unknowingly carrying the seeds of our species' destiny. But why didn't they leave? The answer lies partly in the size of Africa itself, so enormous that within its borders were more resources than entire continents elsewhere. Rivers like the Nile, savannas rich with game, coastal zones bursting with fish. This was not a land to flee, but a land to thrive in. When Europe froze under ice sheets and Asia endured harsh climates, Africa remained a relative sanctuary, warmer, greener, abundant. Some even call it humanity's true Garden of Eden. And yet something more subtle kept our kind bound here: competition. For while Neanderthals roamed Europe and Denisovans haunted Asia, Africa was almost exclusively ours, free of rivals for thousands upon thousands of years. Why would our ancestors risk a perilous journey north when they had no threat at home, no push strong enough to force them outward? Still, the clues scattered in stone and bone whisper of attempts to move. Tools found in the Levant suggest that groups tried to leave as early as 180,000 years ago. But those journeys ended in failure, their bloodlines erased by climate shifts or hostile encounters. It would take countless generations and shifting climates before humanity would finally escape. But before we reach that escape, we need to uncover the shocking truth. Africa was not one birthplace, but many. The evidence shows early sapiens stretching from Morocco to South Africa, from Ethiopia to Kenya, spread out across the continent, long before we thought possible. This challenges the very core of the old narrative: no single Eden, no single dawn, but a Pan-African web of evolving people. And here lies the suspense. If humanity arose everywhere in Africa, how do we even define what a modern human is? Does it require a brain of a certain size, a face of a certain shape, or a spark of creativity expressed in art and tools? The scientists themselves do not agree, and this disagreement is not just academic, it changes the entire story of who we are. Were the Moroccan skulls truly us, or just close enough to pass as family? Stay tuned, because as we journey deeper into this saga, the definition of human itself begins to blur, and with it our sense of identity. As we peer further into the African past, the narrative grows stranger, and the clean lines we once drew between species dissolve into a tangled forest of possibilities. Our ancestors were not alone, and this truth is both humbling and terrifying. At least half a dozen different human relatives coexisted across the globe: Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Indonesia, and Homo naledi in South Africa, whose remains date to around 250,000 years ago, eerily close to the rise of early Homo sapiens. But here's the twist. We didn't just live alongside these other humans, we intermingled with them, left fragments of our DNA in their blood, and absorbed pieces of theirs into ours. Modern Europeans carry traces of Neanderthal genes, while some populations in Asia still carry Denisovan DNA, genetic whispers of long-forgotten encounters. Yet in Africa, for hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens were isolated, evolving without much external interference. That isolation gave us a unique evolutionary path, one that sharpened our brains, refined our tools, and prepared us slowly, almost reluctantly, for the great leap outward. But it was not a straight road. When we speak of Africa as a sanctuary, we must also acknowledge that it was a crucible filled with hardships, droughts, and deadly shifts in climate. Entire regions would wither, forcing people to move, adapt, or perish. This too may explain why we stayed so long. Movement inside Africa was easier than braving the hostile lands beyond its borders. Scientists now call this the Pan-African model of evolution. Instead of emerging in a single location, early Homo sapiens were spread across the entire continent, constantly mixing, migrating, and blending into one another. Think of it less as one origin point and more like a vast web. Threads of different populations weaving together until something unmistakably human emerged. Yet the mystery remains, what exactly pushed us beyond this web? Why risk deserts, mountains, and ice-choked valleys when the heart of Africa sustained us so well? The first attempts, as I hinted before, were tragic failures. Fossils and stone tools in Israel's Levant region suggest that small groups left Africa as early as 180,000 years ago, only to vanish without a trace. Perhaps they were wiped out by climate shifts, perhaps by competition with Neanderthals who were better adapted to colder climates. Whatever the reason, those early pioneers are silent now, their lineage is erased. And here's the suspenseful part. If those early attempts had succeeded, the world might have looked utterly different today. Humanity might have mingled with Neanderthals on equal footing or vanished under their shadow. Instead, our kind remained in Africa, honing skills, developing larger brains, crafting sharper blades. This long delay, far from a weakness, was the secret to our eventual triumph. Because when the next great migration finally came, around 60,000 years ago, we left Africa not as fragile wanderers but as masters of survival. But how did we transform in those intervening millennia? What changed in us that did not exist in our cousins? The answer is coming, and it lies not in bones but in fire, stone, and the very shape of the human skull. Stay tuned, because the next revelation explains not just why we left, but why we conquered. Something extraordinary was happening inside Africa during those long millennia.